When people think of the Maldives, they think of things like overwater villas and snorkeling with exotic marine life or cocktails on the beach. But the last thing they're probably thinking of is Sharia law, highest number of foreign fighters per capita, and climate minister arrested for black magic. Behind all those seemingly blissful islands that so many Westerners flock to for their vacations and honeymoons, this is the reality of the Maldives that we don't see. So how exactly does a Buddhist majority island paradise become an oppressive Islamic theocracy? The country doesn't really have a clearly defined pre-Islamic time period, but what we do know from archaeological evidence like temples and relics is that Buddhism was the religion of the islands for over 1,000 years, and estimates say that this dates back to at least the 3rd century AD. By 1153 AD, the Maldives had officially converted to a fully Islamic country. Some scholars will say this was more of a gradual top-down transition led by the state, influenced by things like trading relations and regional politics. The conversion of all the islands took about another 60 years or so. For a really long time, the Maldives was considered a tourist paradise and sort of a haven for more moderate, non-violent versions of Islam. Compared to neighboring South Asian states, it was largely free of things like terrorism and violence for a long time. Eventually, political reforms like the introduction of a constitution and a parliament led to the Maldives becoming a constitutional monarchy by 1932. From about the 1970s, the Maldives started to become heavily influenced by people who traveled to countries like Saudi, Malaysia, Pakistan, Egypt, and when they returned back home, they brought those really extreme conservative views of Islam with them. Fast forward to 1978, and now we have Maumoon Abdul Gayoom's rule. He served as the president of the Maldives for 30 years, all the way up to 2008. Over the time of his rule, the Maldives started to see really ultra-conservative religious beliefs brought into the country. Over his 3-decade rule, Gayoom consolidated secular and religious powers and started to control and define what the country's interpretation of Islam looked like. By the 1990s, a lot of Maldivians were returning from studying overseas in places like Saudi and Egypt and really started to question Gayoom's legitimacy. That started to lead to a huge rise of repression against religious and political dissent. There were documented cases of things like imprisonment, torture, and even making people shave with chili sauce. Another significant point of contention was the wearing of full face coverings for women. Surprisingly, Gayoom's government wanted to prevent the wearing of full face coverings, and he cited things like security concerns, which, of course, really started to anger the fundamentalist religious people in the country. Tourism also became a massive issue. Gayoom invested a lot into really developing the tourism sector, but as you can imagine, fundamentalists did not like this. They argued that the lifestyle of Western tourists completely contradicted the pious Islamic values of the Maldives. That's when the country really started to see a separation between tourist-designated islands and local islands. The islands with locals had strict religious regulations, whereas on the resort touristy islands, they were a lot more liberal. Around this time, Gayoom started to employ narratives of threats to Islam that didn't sit very well with the fundamentalists. He started referencing things like an old folktale about a sea demon. By 2003, there were so many anti-government protests that a state of emergency was officially declared. Eventually, this forced Gayoom into political reforms, which meant that he had to allow the forming of political parties. At the same time, the rise of fundamentalist Islam really started to take off. This became significantly worse after the 2004 tsunami. The country started to see fundamentalist influence expand rapidly. This led to extreme things like the takeover of Himandhoo Island by religious fundamentalists in 2006. Then, in 2007, the country had its first terrorist attack on one of the main islands for locals called Malé. As these fundamentalist groups really started to gain ground, the country started to see things like pro-ISIS demonstrations in public. There was also a spike in violent attacks against anything perceived as a threat to Islam, including tourists and even moderates who lived in the country. By 2008, Gayoom was officially ousted and Mohamed Nasheed became the first democratically elected president of the Maldives. His presidency lasted from from 2008 to 2012. This guy was a key figure in the country's transition to democratic rule. Throughout his presidency, he prioritized things like environmental issues. He also put in a lot of effort to do things like promote human rights and combat corruption. By 2013, the country saw a new president, Abdulla Yameen, who ironically is the half-brother of Gayoom. This is where things really started to take a turn for the worst. Saudi Arabian involvement in the country's politics and religious outlook really started to take off. They began funding things like Islamic education and infrastructure projects across the country. People say this was part of Saudi's efforts to promote a more conservative, fundamentalist view of Islam, not just in South Asia, but across the entire globe. Now we fast forward to the 6th of May, 2021. Islamists detonated an IED outside the home of former President Nasheed. Nasheed and 4 others, including a British national, were all injured in the attack. In 2024, the Maldives is an extremely polarized society. There's a lot of contention around things like implementing hudud punishments, and there's been a massive increase in conservative Islamic practices. Unfortunately, this has had a profound impact on women. A study conducted in 2016 found that 13% of all females in the Maldives had undergone FGM. It's also required by law that every Maldivian must be a Muslim. The only Muslims who are allowed to openly preach their religious beliefs are Sunni Muslims. In fact, non-Muslims are now prohibited by law to even openly express their religious views. Non-Islamic places of worship like temples or churches are completely prohibited. The government even has strict regulations about importing any kind of material that is seen to oppose Islam. This includes things like religious literature, statues, alcohol, even pork. Education is sickeningly mandated to promote obedience and love of Islam. In fact, Islam is a compulsory subject that has to be taught at every year level in every school. As you can imagine, any criticism of Islam is considered a criminal offense. The country is also using Sharia punishments. This includes things like flogging, stoning, and cutting off people's limbs, all of which are permitted under the country's penal code. In 2018, 2 men received 40 lashes for drinking alcohol, and in 2019, a 25-year-old woman was sentenced to death by stoning for adultery. And don't even get me started on the violent targeting of ex-Muslims and religious and political dissenters. Numerous secular bloggers have been murdered in cold blood. One example is a man called Yameen Rashid. He was a blogger who ran a website called Daily Panic, where he basically poked fun at politicians and just expressed his freedom of speech. In 2017, he was stabbed to death in his home in the Maldives. Then there's the case of another secular blogger, Maumoon Naeem. Shortly after Rashid was murdered, he was threatened with the exact same fate and forced to go into hiding. Thankfully, he's still okay, and you can find him on places like Twitter. And I'm sure by now this isn't going to come as a surprise to you, but leaving Islam is punishable by death. But I'll bet they don't include any of these facts in the all-inclusive honeymoon package that they sell for you for upwards of $10,000, do they? If you do want to read more about some of the insane things that happens to dissenters in the Maldives, I highly recommend looking through the Ex-Muslims of North America case studies. So, for anyone planning their next expensive getaway at this so-called island paradise, I have one piece of advice for you.
Don't do that.